Hi, everyone. This is Achyuta Bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today we are going to take a look at Jupiter's upcoming conjunction to Pluto. So, as most of you know, this is a conjunction that has come around a few times already in 2020. It began when Jupiter entered Capricorn about a year ago and has made a couple of conjunctions, one through forward motion, one through retrograde motion, and now one more through forward motion. And I've seen some graphs floating around, one from Chris Brennan on the astrology podcast, showing the parallel between the Jupiter Pluto conjunctions and the spike of the coronavirus, which is one major way in which Jupiter and Pluto together have, of course, expressed themselves in 2020. If you go back to the original video that I did on the astrology of the coronavirus back in, I think it was probably about March of 2020, you'll notice that in that video and in a few other videos that I did updates on the coronavirus that the main planet that I was tracking was Jupiter's conjunction with Pluto in terms of major turning points in the development of the virus. You could also track Saturn and Pluto and their conjunction this year to a lot of the themes of 2020, including the pandemic. But these themes are all part of the, stellium, in other words, that we've seen this year in Capricorn. But there's a very particular correlation between, spikes in the number of cases per day and the number of deaths we're seeing and the number of testing we're doing and all those kind of things with the Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions this year. So we're in our final Jupiter-Pluto conjunction right now. And there's a lot more to be said. This is not a video exclusively or specifically about the coronavirus, but that will be part of what we're looking at. And it certainly correlates to what we're seeing right now, which is another big spike in the numbers. So that's one part of what we'll talk about today, but also what can you watch for with this transit in general? How long will it last? And what can you watch for, in your personal life too? So if you notice this transit tomorrow, will perfect. Here's Thursday, November 12th, and you'll see there's Jupiter and Pluto. Jupiter's at 2249, Pluto's at 2251. That'll end up perfecting tomorrow on Thursday. But the exact day of the perfection is not so important. It's sort of like comparing it to a full moon. And you guys might have heard me use this analogy before, but you can feel the energy of the full moon on the morning of the full moon, the evening of the full moon, the morning after the full moon. There's a presence that transits have before, during, and after they perfect. Ancient astrologers typically looked at a range of about 3 degrees prior the actual perfection of the aspect, and then about 3 degrees afterward. So if you do 3 degrees afterward, what we're looking at is, let's see, you get to about the beginning of December before you're getting Pluto out of that 3-degree range of separation. But you're really going to see the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction separating and the energy of the big stellium in Capricorn starting to fade a bit once Jupiter and Saturn collectively, both together, move into Aquarius, which is happening about mid-December, and they conjoin on the winter solstice. Now, we're going to be unpacking that transit separately. That's not what I'm going into today. We're going to do probably a big 3-part series, and I might even ask for a few guests or maybe even do a panel again to discuss that one because it's such a big one. And I could see some value in doing that. It'll depend on if I can get all that together or not, but we'll for sure be doing like a 3-part series on it, as that's a major transit. But that's going to change the mood significantly also because Jupiter is on the runway now to get out of Capricorn, where Jupiter is in its fall. So this transit also represents a kind of catharsis for Jupiter, because you're not just looking at Jupiter, Pluto in Capricorn in a vacuum. You're also looking at Jupiter, Pluto as Jupiter is leaving the sign of its fall or depression and is about to pick up dignity, at the very least, by being out of a sign that is detrimental to it. And that's an improvement, and will conjoin Saturn in a sign where Saturn still has a lot of power, but the mood is very different in Aquarius compared to Capricorn. So this conjunction with Pluto signifies a kind of major turning point in the narrative that we've been dealing with for, a couple back to December of 2017, if you take Saturn's entrance into Capricorn as the entry point, but Jupiter as of last December. So big turning points coming up. And this coincides, of course, by the way, with eclipses that are going to be happening in Sagittarius in December, which are in the rulership of Jupiter, as Jupiter has just made this catharsis with Pluto and is changing signs. So big turning points, right? Now, how to track that personally, we'll take a look at that and give you some ideas of what themes to watch. But I thought for now, it would be good to cover this with the real-time clock, just give you a picture of what it looks like. And a reminder for people, because I get this question sometimes, the houses that I'm showing here, what houses they're in, don't matter. This is just a real-time clock of where the planets are in the sky right now. And when we're doing mundane forecasting work, we're not tethering the planets to any house location. To do that would be to, cast a chart for a city or maybe a particular birth chart or something like that. But when we're talking about them generally, mundane forecasting basically works by virtue of the planets and the signs. And it's kind of untethered to any houses in particular until you relate them back to a city's forecast or a person's forecast or something like that. So that's why we don't really pay so much attention to the houses. I get that question so much that I feel like I should say it right now. Anyway, okay, so let's take a look at what Jupiter and Pluto conjoining in Capricorn might mean. You got to keep in mind that this is not happening in a vacuum. Over the next week, we'll also be looking at Venus's squares to Jupiter, Pluto, and Saturn, from the overcoming position. There's a lot more happening in the week ahead. We are also going to have that Venus overcoming these planets as Mercury is also going through another opposition with Uranus. So that can be like a game changer, basically. That transit alone is very powerful. We'll be reading that in the context of Venus squaring these planets. Mars is going to turn direct after a new moon in Scorpio, after being retrograde for a very long time. So there's a lot coming, plus eclipse at the end of the month of November, and then we got eclipse again in December, and then again the big Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius. So there is a lot of astrology left to come before the end of the year. And we're going to have to contextualize what we're talking about today, Jupiter-Pluto, as we go with these other transits. But today we're just going to focus on Jupiter-Pluto alone. All right, so in order to do that, I've got a little list of things that I'm going to talk about today. One of them is that when you have Jupiter on the runway, ready to leave the sign of its fall, but hitting Pluto, the lord of the underworld, Hades, death and rebirth, transformation, and catharsis, what you're going to see in some cases is a moment of catharsis and healing and transformation that can restore one's faith. If you feel like you've been, kind of on your knees metaphorically in the past year because things have been really rough or uncertain, that would be par for the course. Jupiter, a planet associated with piety and faith and trust and optimism and hope, has been, in its depression, entangling with Saturn, the lord of winter and death, and Pluto, the lord of the underworld. When Jupiter is preparing to leave its sign and hitting Pluto, the catharsis that happens right now and in the next week or two can very well signify redemption. Redemption meaning a turnaround for the better. My faith is being restored. Hope is coming back. A sense of a struggle or a long endeavor that one has been struggling with that's suddenly lifted or alleviated. The burden is being lifted somehow. So that's one very basic meaning that Jupiter-Pluto can imply right now. And people will say, well, how is it that Jupiter-Pluto could be so dark during the year, and then all of a sudden it has this very light meaning at the end? Well, that's specifically because this is the last of the conjunctions, and after the conjunction, they part for good, and then Jupiter opens up into Aquarius with better dignity. So that's why we can read this transit potentially as more uplifting or redeeming, even if there's still some last purges that have to be done. So that's one way of looking at this, is that there's a kind of cathartic turning point that could involve the expulsion of malignant forces or energies from within us or within our lives, and a little bit of a last struggle. I've kind of jokingly called it like an end-level boss, but then Jupiter improves its dignity. And so you think of a major turning point. Now, one way in which you can look at this in relation to the coronavirus, for example, is that while numbers are spiking, there's been a report that Pfizer has a 90% effective vaccine that's coming out. I'm not saying everyone should go take a vaccine. I'm not interested in a big debate about vaccines or anything like that. I'm just saying from the archetypal standpoint, from the symbolic standpoint, look at the news and watch how there's this kind of redemptive message. Oh, look, we finally got something that looks like it could be an effective vaccine. It's not the first, probably not the last, vaccine that'll be developed. Who knows if it'll work or not? So I'm not trying to. I don't want to say, oh, that's our salvation from a deadly pandemic. But the point is still that announcement occurs as Jupiter is conjoining Pluto for the last time. Hey, we've got something that looks like it could really help people. So that's kind of the energy in the air. Now, again, even if it's just that feeling of, oh my gosh, we're turning a corner of some kind. Okay, that's in line with the transit of the moment, right? The Jupiter Pluto conjunction. Now, there's also the potential to have suspicion about all of the salvation claims of Jupiter Pluto. For example, Jupiter with Pluto can say, hey, look, I've got your salvation in hand right here, but actually I'm a shady cult leader, right? Or actually, the thing that I'm offering is rooted in hidden or secretive desires or greed or the desire for power or something like that. Remember, Pluto and Jupiter can also be symbolic of plutocracy, which would be the hidden aims of the elite, wealthy ruling class. Now, I'm not trying to sow seeds of conflict in the chat box right now, right? But you have to play with the symbolism a little bit. It's possible, because symbols are multivalent, for there to be elements of all of these things, for something redemptive, cathartic, releasing, purgative, uplifting, a kind of end level boss that you're moving past now. At the same time, you be careful about people who are offering redemption or salvation from something, and there's still maybe elements of hidden corruption or hidden elements of greed or whatever. It's the Jupiter Pluto conjunction, for example, is often, especially in Capricorn where Jupiter is in its fall, is associated with cults, with fundamentalism, with paranoia and conspiracy theories. I'm someone, of course, after like 10 years of my life drinking a whole boatload of ayahuasca, I am very open to the hidden and unseen dimensions of life, and also to I'm not naive enough to believe that everyone has pure and good motives. All I have to do is examine my own heart every day and notice how my own intentions or motivations can get off track very easily in small ways, right? To understand that more power you have, the more likely it is to potentially be corrupted by that power. And so there can be a real mixture of like things that look really good or that look really heroic, but are there's malignancy underneath the surface. For example, someone who looks really strong but is on steroids, that's a Jupiter-Pluto dynamic, maybe a little bit of Jupiter-Neptune too. So you do have to, there's a line between trying to read and sense the underlying reality of a situation and understand the underlying motivations, and to become paranoid. There's a fine line between those two things when Jupiter and Pluto are together. That's been something we've been dealing with all year. At the same time, Jupiter Pluto is here to awaken us to our own hidden and sometimes malignant patterns or motivations or unconscious dark spots, so to speak. So, it's a fine line between these things. One thing that I've learned over time in working with a lot of people is that people are not purely good or purely bad. So when we look at the world and we imagine that, that there's like that there are dark forces behind a lot of the ways in which the world operates, there's truth to that. But a lot of the times we also we see that and then we turn it into a kind of comic book where in our minds it's like there's good guys and there's bad guys. There's an evil horde of villains and then there's good guys over here. We do that to each other politically. We spin a lot of our narratives like that. And the truth is that most people, even when they're not doing great things, it's usually a lot of times it's more unconscious because they will think that they're doing something that's really good or noble, and they aren't always aware of the degree to which it is selfish or to which they're might be manipulated by their own unconscious greed or desires or lust for power or something like that. So mercy is really, really important right now. Mercy, grace, forgiveness, compassion, patience. Because the one thing that Jupiter Pluto will have us do sometimes is to go to extremes, either our own unconscious hungers or drive for power or righteousness will take over somehow, and we will be clouded over by a sense of Zeus-like power in a confidence and certainty that we're right, the way we see the world is absolutely correct. Or on the other hand, we if we're not getting overpowered by our own certainty, we may be taking things at face value and not digging deeply enough. And so, either way, there's a danger in that, right? So summarized, Jupiter and Pluto can also represent a tendency to view things in really stark, rigid ways. The reason for that is that this is Saturn's sign. Saturn is the lord of oppositions in astrology and a planet that can easily drag us into very dualistic thinking. And so when you got Jupiter, the planet of faith, hope, truth, philosophy, it is connected with ideology, and then you're conjoining it with Pluto. It's as though our ideologies may need a little bath, or they may need to be cleansed in some ways. At the same time, there's the need for mercy and forgiveness is really big. I'll just repeat that. What I mean by that is that the need to be very patient with ourselves as we are uncovering some of our own hidden issues or things that we have not been very aware of. As well as what's being revealed in the world, that there's a patience for it because in some ways it's like it's like poison that's being drawn from a wound. You have to recognize there's a process taking place, and that a lot of unconsciousness is at work, which doesn't mean that people shouldn't have accountability, that we shouldn't have accountability, but it also means that understanding is the real antidote. Understanding what's happening, understanding why it's happened, and not wielding that understanding like weaponizing it and trying to harm other people with it. All of which Jupiter and Pluto and Capricorn can do. So, let's see what else is on my list here. You have also something that's been like a long awaited transformation. If you've been persevering through a passage in your life it felt like it's lasted for a long time, that's Saturn getting ready to leave a sign, and Jupiter and Pluto, hanging around in the same sign. And there's this theme of long suffering, long endurance, perseverance. It has almost gospel-like feeling to it. How long, Lord? How long do I have to wait? But what is it? Psalm 40, I think it is. It says that I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined and heard my cry. So there's this way in which Jupiter Pluto is also the sense of a sincere cry that we've been and something we've been waiting on and then being answered and hearing the response. You also get a little bit of the feeling of Job, where Job's faith is tested over and over and over again by calamity and misfortune and disaster. But there's also, there is restoration. There is the rebuilding of what is lost. So those are things that are also happening in the process, not just of the Pluto Jupiter conjunction, but the transformation of Jupiter into Aquarius, because again, it picks up so much dignity. You also have, again, the potential to want to strong arm people or to uses of force and righteousness, as well as you could say some attempt to dominate through sheer acts of power, but also in ways that are coercive and undermining and manipulative, because Pluto can be very unseen. So Jupiter's like Zeus. It can try to muscle and assert its authority in more rigid ways in Saturn's sign. And then with Pluto, there's often this unseen or more hidden attempts to manipulate power, or to stay in power, or to strong arm others out of power. That those are all those are all the secret dealings of Zeus right now, you could say. It's interesting too to think that, you know, Zeus, Jupiter, and Hades are like brothers in mythology. So there's also a way in which the underworld becomes the overworld. And that's part of what we've been living through for the past year as well, where all sorts of things that exist, that we secrets or levels or layers of information that exist below the surface are really prominent. And then they in something that exists below the surface is also not just secret information or secret truths, but also what exists below the surface are people's prejudices, fears, paranoia, things like that. And so those things come up, and the underworld becomes the overworld. And that's because Jupiter is in its fall in Zeus, in the sign with Saturn and Hades, right? So you're taking the underworld and making it the overworld. Well, what's going to happen in the next few weeks is that the underworld, rather than being out in the light of day, is going to flip back to the underworld, and we're going to get that dichotomy sort of reversed again. Now, that might seem on the surface like, yay, everyone's cheering, yay, the darkness is gone. But the darkness plays such an important role in keeping us alert to truth and keeping us aware of hidden motivations or unconscious things that exist in the unconscious, which are rich and life-giving, and not, and as well as potentially just, paranoid and demonic. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out, especially given that Aquarius has a whole new set of challenges that come with it. So that's what we've got. That's what I've got on my list for today. Those are the biggest things that I wanted to say. Kind of a smattering of themes, but I hope that you can feel it. And I'd love to hear your own thoughts and just hear how you're noticing it, and other themes that you might add to the list with Jupiter and Pluto. I know that there's a lot, but the thing I want to come back to one last time before I end here is just that potential for us to paint things in terms of the hard dualities of Saturn. Remember, Saturn, the dimmest and most distant planet, sitting on the threshold in ancient astrology between the realm of the visible and the invisible. Manilius, a Roman poet, associates Saturn with the underworld. So before there was Pluto in the sky, Saturn in some ways held the place of Pluto in terms of being, Saturn is Kronos. Saturn, right, is a god that was ruler of the golden age, the status quo, and is then cast out and usurped by Zeus, and he then falls down. And that fallenness is very much associated with the underworld. For example, Manilius associates Saturn with the fourth house in ancient astrology, this kind of underworld, subterranean place. And he says that Saturn rules over the plights of the old and of fathers. And what he means by that is also the way in which there's always this alternation between things that rise up and become powerful, and then things that are suppressed or pushed down as a result of the powerful rising up. So anytime that we have alternations of power, there's a temptation because Saturn is a planet that also represents the duality or the dichotomy of those who are in power and those who are out of power, those who are insiders and those who are outcasts, those who are popular, those who are black sheep. Saturn is a planet that encapsulates the exchange between those dualities and is a very liminal planet in this regard. So when you have Jupiter Pluto in that sign kind of encapsulating the underworld, like I said, the underworld gets flipped up so you can see it. But the most important thing to understand is that we have a tendency when those dualities are capturing us, are grabbing us. Remember, the planets in Indian astrology called grahas, they can grab our consciousness literally. And when they grab us in that way, we tend to think there's a good guy and there's a bad guy. There's a good thing and there's a bad thing. There's evil and there's good. And, oftentimes we think, oh, well, you know, I'll feel better again once my opponent is suppressed. Right. And as long as we're involved in that kind of thinking, it from the standpoint of archetypal psychology and from the standpoint of the meaning of the ancient meaning of the planets, even, we may not be aware yet the extent to which we have both sides within us. We have the dark, the hidden, the subterranean, the Plutonian, the Saturnine, the fallen Jupiter. We have all of that in us. You can see it by virtue of the fact that there are ideologues and self-righteous purists on both sides of the political spectrum who are very nasty to the people that they oppose, who demonize the other, whoever the other might be. And I'm not trying to make broad sweeping moral equivalencies or anything like that, but just that beware of the temptation of saying, I feel good, I win in life when those that I oppose are smote down, right? That's a very Jupiter-Pluto dynamic that can fill us with self-righteousness, and it can make the good thing taste of poison. On the other hand, there is a tendency for us to also be truly overpowered by dark or malignant unconscious forces within ourselves that may actually need to be called out into the light of day and say, enough of that, that it's time for that to go, that's just sick. And but you have to have grace for that whole process, that you have to have patience. You have to realize that your soul is untouched by all of these moving fields of the planets, that these experiences that move through us, that's not who we are. And it's very hard to have that perspective and to really learn and see the hand of the divine in all of these movements unless we're pairing our study of astrology with a spiritual practice of some kind. I'm like, you always hear me say this, but it's really hard to get distance and to see these vacillations unless you're sitting and able to reflect or contemplate or meditate or pray or take some time for just a walk. It's really hard to get distance from them, and the more that we participate in them as though that's what will make or break happiness or peace or contentment, that's when we're being grabbed and that's when we're being seized. So remember that Pluto Jupiter can just as easily be the dark face of self-righteousness, and it can tempt us into thinking that there is evil and there is good in some very pure sense. And so we need a lot of forgiveness and understanding. Love as the ultimate goal of spiritual life. The consciousness of love is the consciousness that allows for dualities to exist, does not pretend as though they do not exist, but holds them all in a space of acceptance and love. Love holds opposites together. Love allows opposites to exist allows them to exist in a relationship of understanding. Where there's understanding, the archetypal polarities, once at war with each other, become complementary. They become dancing, and they become the representation of lovers rather than these dueling opposites. So that's it. That's a lot. So anyway, I hope you guys are having what is it today? Wednesday. I hope you guys are having a good Wednesday. I'd love to hear your comments, and I'd also love to hear your reflections on this transit. What other things are you noticing? How else would you describe this transit? I'm always interested in hearing your input. Last but not least, my new class, Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystics, starts on Saturday. Gosh, just a few days left. So there's a few days left to register with the early bird rate. You save $500 off when you do that. There's need-based tuition. There's a variety of different ways in which you may qualify for need-based tuition. So check them out on my website. There's a payment plan if you need it. Yeah, I've done a few Q&A videos already. If you go back in my archives, you'll find some Q&A videos about the course if you have more questions about it. It's on my website, nightlightastrology.com. It's the first year course. And if you have any questions, you can email me, info@nightlightastrology.com. All right, I hope you guys have a great day. Take it easy. Bye.